"You still fixing toilets for a living, Nolan?" Meredith's voice cut clean across the table, bright with wine and cruelty. "Because last I checked, Daisy's tuition doesn't pay itself with a plumber's wrench." Laughter rippled down both sides of the long table, uncles and cousins joining in like it was rehearsed. Nolan kept his eyes on his plate and cut another piece of chicken, slow, even, unbothered on the surface. At the far end of the table, one person did not laugh. Harper set down her fork and watched her sister with something that was no longer patience. Nolan Ferris had learned, over the past 2 years, that silence was the only currency that never ran out. He kept a small workshop behind a hardware store on Bull Street, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a coffee pot that never quite got clean, and most mornings he was there by 7, sleeves rolled, hands already smelling of solder and grease before the sun cleared the live oaks. His life had shrunk to a manageable size after the divorce, and he had built it that way on purpose. A rented house 2 streets from Daisy's school, a truck with 190,000 miles on it, a calendar that revolved entirely around an 8-year-old schedule of pickups, spelling tests, and the 7:30 bedtime she still, occasionally, let him enforce. Every morning began the same way. He braided Daisy's hair badly and she corrected him without complaint, guiding his fingers with the patience of a much older person. He made her oatmeal with too much cinnamon because that was how she liked it. He walked her the 4 blocks to Chatham Elementary and stood at the corner until she disappeared through the doors, the way he had done since the first week, the way he suspected he would keep doing long after she stopped needing him to. The Coulson family had decided, somewhere in the 2 years since Meredith left him, that Nolan was a mistake she had corrected. They said it kindly at first, a shame it didn't work out. He's a good father, at least, and then less kindly as Meredith remarried into money and the family's tone shifted to match hers. He was the cautionary tale now, trotted out at holidays as proof of what happened when you married beneath your prospects. He never argued the point. Arguing required information he had decided, years ago, not to give them. Harper Coulson did not share her sister's appetite for cruelty, though she had inherited the same sharp eyes and the same habit of noticing what other people missed. She was 37, a contracts attorney for the city of Savannah, and on the Tuesday after that dinner she sat in her office on Bay Street with a case file open in front of her that had nothing, as far as she knew, to do with her family. The file concerned the Savannah riverfront restoration, a historic redevelopment project worth tens of millions of dollars, currently crawling through a bidding process that had already outlasted 2 city administrators. Harper had been assigned to review contractor disclosures for conflicts of interest. It was tedious work, mostly names she didn't recognize attached to companies she'd never heard of, and she worked through it that afternoon without a single thought of her sister's husband or the ex-brother-in-law nobody in her family bothered to ask about anymore. That evening, walking Daisy back from the library, Nolan felt the old itch again, the one he never let anyone see. It arrived usually after a family dinner, a low current of restlessness that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the version of himself he'd folded up and put away. He had built something once. He had signed his name to blueprints that other men built cities from. He had walked into rooms where people stood up when he entered them. He had also watched that version of himself fail his marriage in ways no amount of success could fix, and when Meredith left, he had made a choice nobody in his family understood. He let the company run itself, kept his name off the letterhead in public, and became, deliberately, a man who fixed things with his hands so that no one would ever again mistake his worth for his income. Daisy tugged his sleeve. "You're doing the quiet thinking face again. Just thinking about work," he said, which was true, and also nothing like the truth she imagined. She didn't press. She never did. It was one of the things he loved most about her. She let people keep what they needed to keep. He had not always been a man who kept things. There had been a version of him, once, who wanted every room to know exactly what he was worth, who signed contracts under his own name in bold letters and let photographers into the ribbon-cutting ceremonies. That man had been married to Meredith, too, for a while. Before the long hours and the harder failures wore a groove between them, that neither of them had known how to climb out of. The company hadn't ended the marriage. He understood that now, 2 years and a great deal of quiet on his own. But it had made the ending easier for everyone to explain, and easier still for Meredith's family to believe, which was its own kind of mercy. In the end, a story simple enough that nobody had to look too closely at the truer, sadder one underneath it. 3 days later, Harper drove out past Bull Street to return a library book Daisy had left in the back of her car, a small errand that felt, at the time, like nothing at all. The workshop smelled like machine oil and cut wood. Nolan was hunched over a bench, a stack of mail pushed to one corner, and when the bell rang he turned with the easy, slightly wary courtesy he showed everyone in her family now. "She forgot this at the house Sunday," Harper said, holding out the book. "She's always forgetting something." He wiped his hands on a rag and reached for it, and in doing so knocked the stack of mail sideways, letters fanning across the bench. The workshop was smaller than Harper had expected, though she hadn't given it much thought before that afternoon. A single room with a concrete floor, a wall of hand tools arranged with more precision than the place's general clutter suggested, and a corkboard by the register pinned with one of Daisy's drawings, curling slightly at the corners from the humidity. It looked, in every visible way, exactly like what Nolan claimed to be. That was what made the envelope, when it surfaced, land so strangely, not because it contradicted the room, but because it didn't. It simply sat there, folded into the ordinary mess of a working man's counter, as if it had always belonged there and had simply never been noticed. Harper bent to help gather them, the habit of a lifetime of tidying up other people's messes, and her hand stopped on one envelope before she decided to stop it. Heavy cardstock. A return address downtown, in the same corridor of buildings where she'd spent that Tuesday afternoon combing through riverfront disclosures. And above the address, embossed in a plain, unshowy font that somehow made it more convincing, Ferris Infrastructure Group Office of the President. Nolan's hand closed over the envelope a half-second too late. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. That was the strange, electric silence that passed between them, her eyes lifting to his face, his jaw tightening, both of them understanding that something had just been seen that was not meant to be seen, and neither of them willing to be the one who said it out loud. "Thanks for bringing this by," he said finally, setting the envelope face down beneath the others. "Sure," Harper said, and left without another word, though she sat in her car for a full minute afterward before starting the engine, turning the name over in her mind. Ferris. Infrastructure. President. She had read that name 3 days ago, in a file on her own desk, as one of 2 finalists competing for the riverfront contract. She did not yet know that the second finalist's paperwork had crossed her sister's husband's desk that same morning, or that Bradley Kessler had circled a line item in red ink and made a single phone call about an entity he referred to, with unmistakable irritation, as the ghost bidder. Bradley Kessler ran his side of the deal from a conference room on the 14th floor, all glass and city view, 3 phones lined up on the table like a general's artillery. He was a city councilman with the manners of a man who had never once been told no and meant it, and the riverfront project was, to him, less a public good than a proving ground. The deal that would put his name on the ribbon-cutting photo and his allies in the room for whatever came next. The problem was Ferris Infrastructure Group, a firm with an immaculate bid, deep capital, and, infuriatingly, no public face, no press, no gala appearances, no name Bradley could call and lean on, just numbers that beat his preferred contractor by a margin large enough to matter, and a silence around the company's ownership that felt, to a man used to knowing everyone's leverage, like an insult. Bradley had built his entire career on knowing things about people before they knew he knew them. He kept a mental ledger of favors owed and debts collected, and the riverfront project was meant to be the largest entry that Ledger had ever seen, the deal that turned a city councilman into a name mentioned for higher office. A faceless competitor with better numbers wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a variable he couldn't price, and men like Bradley did not tolerate variables they couldn't price. "Find out who's behind it," he told his aide that evening. Everyone's somebody's somebody. Find the thread and pull it. He had no idea he already had. The following Sunday brought another family obligation, Meredith's monthly call, which had, since the divorce, evolved into a ritual less about affection than accounting. She wanted to know if Harper was coming to the early Christmas dinner. She wanted to know if Harper had finally stopped being strange about Nolan. She wanted, mostly, agreement. The way she had always wanted it from her younger sister, ever since they were girls, and Meredith decided which version of events the family would believe. "He's not a bad person, Mer," Harper said carefully. "I just don't think he's who you say he is." "He's exactly who I say he is," Meredith said, with the particular brightness she used when she wanted a subject closed. "A nice man with no ambition who couldn't keep up." "I'm not being cruel, Harper. I'm being honest. Somebody has to be." Harper let it go, the way she had learned to let things go with her sister, but she carried the conversation with her differently now. She thought of the envelope. She thought of the name on her desk. She did not yet have proof of anything, only the particular unsettled feeling of a woman who suspects she has been handed half a story and told to call it whole. She did not confront Nolan. Rule of her profession and, increasingly, rule of her own instinct. You did not accuse a man of being more than he appeared to be. You watched, and you waited, and you let the truth arrive at its own pace. But she started watching Nolan differently after that. Not with suspicion, with something closer to respect, the quiet, involuntary kind that arrives before a person has decided to feel it. The guardianship paperwork arrived on Harper's desk 2 weeks later, a routine update to Daisy's custody file that required signatures from both parents and, as family liaison, a notarized copy from Harper herself. She called Nolan to arrange it, and he suggested the workshop, since Daisy had karate at 4 and he didn't want to leave the shop unattended past close. He had coffee waiting when she arrived, black, in a mug that said "World's Okayest Mechanic," a joke gift from Daisy that he clearly hadn't the heart to replace. "You didn't have to do that," Harper said. "You drove out here on your day off. Least I could do." They worked through the paperwork at the workbench, exchanging pens, correcting each other's dates, the conversation staying carefully, deliberately on the subject in front of them. Neither of them mentioned the envelope. Neither of them mentioned Meredith. It was, on its surface, the most administrative hour either of them had spent in weeks. And it was also, underneath, the first time either of them had felt entirely comfortable in the other's company. "She talks about you a lot," Harper said, signing the last line. "Daisy. Not complaining, just a lot. She talks about everyone a lot. It's the age." "No," Harper said, capping her pen. "It's not the age. It's you." He didn't answer that, but something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, the way a man's do when he has been braced for an insult and receives. Instead, something almost like kindness. Daisy arrived from school before Harper left, backpack dragging, and without any prompting climbed onto the stool between them and started narrating, in exhaustive detail, an argument she'd had with a classmate about whether hermit crabs felt lonely. Neither adult tried to redirect her. They both just listened, and somewhere in the 11 minutes it took Daisy to resolve the hermit crab question to her own satisfaction, Nolan and Harper found themselves, for the first time, laughing at the same thing, at the same moment, without either one performing it for the other. It did not feel like nothing. It also did not feel like anything either of them was ready to name. By the following week, Bradley's pressure campaign had teeth. He leaned on 2 smaller subcontractors who'd hoped to partner with Ferris Infrastructure, quietly suggesting that continued cooperation might affect other, unrelated permits their companies needed downtown. He had a friend on the Historic Preservation Board, slow walk an environmental review that should have taken 10 days and was, by design, taking 30. None of it was illegal, exactly. All of it was the particular, deniable cruelty of a man who had learned early that power didn't need to break rules if it could simply exhaust the people who followed them. Desmond Cruz had run Nolan's job sites for 11 years, since before the company had a name anyone outside the industry would recognize, and he was the only person besides Nolan's lawyers who knew the full shape of what Ferris Infrastructure actually was. He'd signed an agreement, back when the company restructured after the divorce, promising his silence on ownership matters in exchange for a controlling stake in his own division, a fair trade, at the time, for a man who wanted stability more than recognition. He called Nolan on a Thursday evening, voice low even though he was alone in his truck. "Somebody's been asking about you," Desmond said. "Not the usual due diligence. Somebody with a badge from the council trying to figure out who signs your checks." Nolan stood in his kitchen, phone against his ear, watching Daisy do homework at the table, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. "Let them ask," he said. "There's nothing illegal about staying quiet. There's nothing illegal about a lot of things that still get ugly, Nolan. You built this whole life so nobody could touch her." He meant Daisy. He always meant Daisy. Don't let pride cost you the thing you built it to protect. Nolan didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake running the arithmetic he'd run before, years ago, when the company was young and every decision felt like a wager against his own family's peace. How much of himself was he willing to spend to win a fight nobody had forced him to enter? He thought about walking away from the bid entirely, handing Bradley's preferred contractor the win, letting the whole apparatus of scrutiny lose interest in a man who'd simply stopped competing. It would be easy, in the practical sense. A phone call to his lawyers, a withdrawal filed by Friday, and by the following week nobody in Savannah would remember there had ever been a second bidder at all. Daisy would never know the difference. She would keep braiding correction into his clumsy attempts at her hair, keep narrating hermit crab arguments at the dinner table, keep believing, as she always had, that her father's whole world began and ended at the workshop on Bull Street. There was a version of peace in that. He had chosen it once already and hadn't regretted it. Not really. Not until a folder in Harper's hands had made the old life feel suddenly unfinished instead of simply over. He thought, too, about Harper's face in the workshop doorway, the way she hadn't asked, the way she'd looked at him like a person deciding whether to trust what she'd seen instead of demanding he explain it. He didn't call her. He told himself it wasn't the time. He told himself a lot of things that week that weren't quite lies and weren't quite true either. Harper, unaware of the phone call, unaware of Desmond, spent that same week finishing her review of the Riverfront file, and it was in the course of that ordinary work that she saw Bradley for the first time doing something she couldn't unsee. She'd stopped by his office to drop off a signed memorandum, a small, unremarkable errand, and found the door half open, Bradley's voice pitched low and hard, telling someone on the phone that if a certain subcontractor didn't find a reason to walk, their inspection schedule downtown was going to get a lot less convenient. She stood in the hallway a moment too long. Bradley looked up, saw her, and smiled the smile he used on everyone, easy and unbothered, as if she couldn't possibly have heard what she'd heard. "Council business," he said. "You know how it is." She didn't know how it was. She was beginning, for the first time, to suspect she didn't know her sister's husband at all. That Sunday brought the early Christmas dinner, a Colson tradition older than Harper's memory, hosted this year at Meredith and Bradley's house on Whitaker Street, all garland and candlelight, and the particular tension of a family performing warmth it hadn't quite earned. Nolan came, as he always did, for Daisy's sake. Seated near the far end of the table where Meredith had, without ever saying so directly, decided he belonged. The house was done up in white lights and magnolia garland, Meredith's decorating instincts as precise as everything else about her, and the table had been set with the good china that only came out twice a year. Bradley sat at the head, playing the gracious host, refilling glasses with a warmth that Harper now watched with new and uncomfortable suspicion, wondering how much of it had ever been real. The mockery arrived earlier than usual, a second glass of wine into the evening. "I hear Chatham Prep raised tuition again," Meredith said, "to no one and everyone. Good thing Daisy's not applying. Some of us have to be realistic about what we can offer." She looked at Nolan when she said it, the way she always did, testing to see if this would finally be the night he flinched. He didn't. He cut his chicken. But Harper set her glass down hard enough that the crystal rang. That's enough, Mir. The table went quiet in a different register than before, not the comfortable, complicit quiet of shared cruelty, but the uneasy quiet of witnesses realizing a rule had just been broken. Meredith stared at her sister like she was seeing a stranger. I'm just being honest, Meredith said. You're just being cruel, Harper said, and dressing it up as honesty because it's easier than admitting you don't actually know what you're talking about. She didn't explain further. She couldn't, not yet, not without proof, and the not yet sat in her chest all through the rest of dinner like a held breath. Nolan's phone buzzed as he was buckling Daisy into her booster seat afterward. Desmond's name on the screen, and 3 words that made his stomach drop before he'd even opened the message, "Call me now." He called from the driveway while Daisy hummed to herself in the back seat, watching him through the window with the particular attentiveness of a child who knows something is wrong and has decided not to ask. Someone filed an anonymous complaint against the company, Desmond said. No preamble, financial irregularities, unverified ownership, the works. It landed on the council's ethics desk an hour ago. You've got 48 hours to respond before they freeze the bid pending review. Nolan closed his eyes. 48 hours. 2 days to either prove himself or lose, quietly and permanently, the last thing his old life had left him. Desmond Cruz had carried the secret of Ferris Infrastructure's ownership for 11 years, and in all that time he had never once considered breaking it because Nolan had never once asked him to lie only to stay quiet, which felt, to a man raised on the particular ethics of a construction site, like an entirely different obligation. But he had also, over those 11 years, watched Nolan build something worth more than the company, a girl who adored her father, a life that had survived a divorce without turning bitter, a decency that never once curdled into the resentment Desmond had seen wreck better men. He was not going to watch it dismantled by a councilman with a grudge and a stack of forged deniability. Desmond had been there the week the first company folded, back when he was still just a foreman with 2 years on the job and a boss barely older than he was. He remembered the auction of the equipment, the calls that stopped being returned, and Nolan standing in an empty warehouse with a legal pad, rebuilding the whole business from a list of names he still trusted. He had followed him into the new company, not out of obligation, but because he had never again wanted to watch a good man lose everything to a man who simply had more lawyers. He was not about to let it happen twice. He drove to Harper's office instead of Nolan's workshop, a decision he made somewhere on the bridge over the river, reasoning that Harper had already seen enough to be trusted with the rest, and that Nolan, bound by his own decade-old promise of silence, would never bring himself to say it first. "You don't know me," Desmond said, standing in Harper's doorway with a battered accordion folder under his arm, "but I think you already know more than you're letting on. I need you to know the rest." He laid it out across her desk, document by document, the way he'd rehearsed it in the truck. Ferris Infrastructure Group's true ownership, unchanged in structure since its founding, Nolan's name on every controlling document, buried behind a holding company designed for privacy, not deception. And beneath that, older, yellowed paperwork from a decade earlier, the collapse of Nolan's first company, the one he'd built in his 20s with nothing but an engineering degree and stubbornness, and the fraudulent supply contract that had gutted it overnight. The contract bore a signature Harper recognized immediately, because she had seen it 100 times on family documents, on wedding registries, on the deed to the house on Whitaker Street. Bradley Kessler. 10 years ago, Desmond said, before your sister ever met him, Bradley ran a materials firm that supplied Nolan's first company. He forged delivery records, billed for shipments that never arrived, and when Nolan caught it and threatened to go public, Bradley buried him in litigation until the company folded. Nolan rebuilt everything from scratch under a name nobody would connect to the wreckage. He never told your family because there was nothing left to prove, and no version of the truth that wouldn't have sounded like bitterness. Harper sat very still, the pieces reassembling themselves into a shape she hadn't let herself see. Meredith had married, without ever knowing it, the very man who'd destroyed her first husband's life, and had spent 2 years mocking Nolan for the wreckage her own husband had caused. "Does Nolan know you're here?" she asked. "No," Desmond said. "And he'd probably be furious if he did. He spent 10 years choosing peace over vindication. But peace doesn't survive a 48-hour clock, ma'am. Somebody has to choose for him this time." Harper drove straight to the workshop that evening, folder in hand, and found Nolan closing up, the shop lights half dimmed, the day's exhaustion sitting visibly on him for the first time since she'd known him. "Desmond came to see me," she said, before he could ask why she was there. Something in Nolan's face closed, briefly, the old reflex of a man protecting a wound he'd learned to hide well. "He shouldn't have." "He should have," Harper said, "and I need you to hear that from me before you're angry at him for it." She set the folder on the workbench between them. "I know what Bradley did. I know what it cost you. And I know my sister has spent 2 years humiliating you for a failure your own family caused and never told you they caused." Nolan looked at the folder for a long moment without touching it. "I didn't want this fight," he said finally. "I built a whole life specifically so I'd never have to have it again." "I'm not asking you to want it," Harper said. "I'm telling you it's already here, whether you want it or not, and I am done watching people I love hurt people I 12. She stopped herself, the sentence running further than she'd meant to let it. He looked up at that. Neither of them finished it out loud. They spent the next 2 hours at the workbench instead, not talking about careers or company names or anything either of them had spent months carefully avoiding, only about Bradley, about the ethics complaint, about the narrow 48-hour window, and what it would take to fill it with something undeniable. Harper knew the council's procedures better than anyone else in the city. Nolan knew the paper trail of his own ruin better than anyone alive. Between them, working in a small pool of workbench light with the shop radio playing low, they built a case. Harper walked him through what a formal hearing would require: sworn documentation, a witness willing to speak on the record, a timeline that could survive cross-examination from a councilman with every incentive to discredit it. Nolan listened, made notes in the same steady hand he used for invoices, and did not once flinch from the parts of the old story that were hardest to say out loud. When he described the week the first company folded, his voice stayed level, but his hands, Harper noticed, had gone still on the bench, the way a man's do when he is holding something very carefully so it doesn't break again. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, when he finished. "I know that," he said. Knowing it and saying it out loud in a room full of people who used to respect me are two different things. "Then let me say it," Harper said. "You don't have to be the one who has to sound convincing. I'll be convincing enough for both of us." At one point, reaching for the same document, their hands landed together on the same corner of paper. Neither of them moved for a moment. The radio kept playing. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling and gone. Nolan withdrew his hand first, gently, and Harper let him, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing that needed saying, only something that had, quietly, without either of them deciding it, already begun. Word reached Bradley within the day that Harper had met with someone from Nolan's company, and by evening he understood, with the particular clarity of a man watching his own leverage evaporate, exactly what that meant. He called Meredith first, not to warn her, but to instruct her. "Your sister's playing a dangerous game," he said. "I need you to talk to her. Family loyalty, all that. Before this gets messier than it needs to be." "Messier how?" Meredith asked. And something in his silence, a half-second too long, planted the first seed of doubt she would spend the next several days trying to talk herself out of. The ethics hearing convened on a Thursday morning in a council chamber that smelled of old carpet and courthouse coffee, 5 council members at the dais, and a scattering of press in the back rows, who'd shown up expecting a routine procedural item and were about to get something else entirely. Harper stood at the podium in her contracts attorney best, folder open, voice steady in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed calm because the alternative felt too costly. She laid out the anonymous complaint first, then dismantled it document by document, financial disclosures verified, ownership structure legitimate and legal, every irregularity Bradley's camp had alleged traced back to a filing error his own aide had made and then blamed on the other side. Then she laid out the rest. The supply contract from a decade earlier. The forged delivery records. The signature that matched, unmistakably, unforgeably. The councilman seated 3 rows behind her, whose face had gone the color of old paper the moment she'd said his name. "This isn't a conflict of interest," Harper said, closing the folder. "It's a man trying to bury the evidence of what he did the first time, before somebody could prove he'd do it again." The press in the back rows had stopped checking their phones. A council aide, halfway through pouring water, set the pitcher down without finishing and simply listened. Bradley's face, which had begun the hearing composed and faintly bored, had gone rigid. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic on how much damage was still containable and finding, with each new document Harper laid on the podium, that the number kept climbing. Bradley stood, objected, called it a smear, called it a family grudge dressed up as due diligence, and for a moment the room hung in the balance the way rooms do before they decide which version of events they're going to believe. Then Desmond stood, in the back row, and asked to be recognized, and told the council, plainly and without embellishment, what he had watched happen to a small, honest company 11 years ago, and to the man who'd rebuilt his whole life rather than let it define him. The council recessed for 40 minutes. When they returned, the vote was 6-1, Bradley's own allies among them, unwilling to let his fraud become theirs, stripping him of oversight on the riverfront project and awarding the contract, cleanly, publicly, to Ferris Infrastructure Group. Nolan sat through all of it in the second row, Daisy safely at school, his hands folded in his lap, the old itch he'd carried for 2 years finally, quietly, going still. Meredith arrived at Nolan's house that same evening, unannounced, still in the same coat she'd worn to work, her composure gone in a way Harper had never once seen in 30 years of being her sister. "I didn't know," she said, before Nolan had even opened the screen door fully. "About the contract, about what he did to you. I swear to God, Nolan, I didn't know." He believed her. It cost him nothing to believe her, not anymore, not with the vote already cast and the company already secure. "I know you didn't," he said. "I made you into a joke at my own family's table," she said, and her voice cracked on it, the performance finally, entirely gone. "For 2 years. And the whole time the person who actually ruined something was sitting across from me at Thanksgiving, carving the turkey. You didn't know," Nolan said again, "because it was true, and because there was no version of cruelty in continuing to punish her for a truth she hadn't had access to. She didn't ask for forgiveness that night. She only stood on his porch a while longer and then left, quiet in a way the Coulson family had never once seen her be. The family learned the rest of it slowly, over the following week. In the particular fragmented way, families learn hard truths a little from Meredith, a little from the news coverage of the hearing, a little from Harper, who told it plainly and without embellishment to anyone who asked. Meredith told her parents the truth at Sunday dinner. 2 nights later, without Nolan present, her voice flat and unadorned in a way that made the table go silent for reasons that had nothing to do with cruelty this time. She told them what Bradley had done, what she hadn't known, and quietly, almost as an aside, that the things she'd said to Nolan across that same table for 2 years had come from her own fear of having failed, not from anything true about the man she'd said them to. Nobody applauded her honesty. Nobody needed to. It was enough that she'd said it. Their mother reached across the table afterward and took Meredith's hand, an old, unspoken gesture from childhood that meant more than any speech could have. Their father said nothing at all, only looked, for a long moment, at the empty chair where Nolan would have sat had he been invited, and seemed, for the first time in 2 years, to understand exactly what that empty chair had cost. The family's regard for Nolan shifted in the weeks that followed, not because he was wealthy, most of them still didn't fully grasp the scale of it, and he made no effort to correct that, but because they had finally seen, in the space of one ethics hearing, exactly how much he had carried without complaint. A man who'd been humiliated at their table for 2 years and had never once, not even with the truth in his hand, raised his voice to defend himself. Harper found him afterward, one evening at the workshop. Both of them worn thin from a week that had asked more of each of them than either had expected to give. "You could have told them the truth months ago," she said, ended it in one sentence. "I could have," he agreed. "But then it would have been about being right. I'd rather it be about Daisy having a family that isn't built on who's winning." Harper looked at him a long moment, the workshop lights low, the radio off for once, and said the thing she'd been carrying since the envelope, since the workbench, since the hallway outside Bradley's office. "I like who you are when nobody's watching," she said. "I think that's rarer than anything you own." He didn't have an answer for that either, not one made of words, but he didn't need one. Something had already been said in the silence between them for weeks, and they both, finally, let themselves hear it. Spring came to Savannah the way it always did, all at once, azaleas breaking open along Whitaker Street, and the air going soft and warm off the river. The Colson family gathered again for dinner, the first since the hearing, at Harper's house this time instead of Meredith's, a small shift nobody remarked on out loud but everyone understood. Daisy sat between her father and Harper, narrating something about a science fair project involving baking soda, utterly unaware that she was, in her own small way, the reason the two adults on either side of her had found their way to each other at all. Meredith sat further down the table, quieter than the family had ever known her to be, having asked and been granted a kind of provisional forgiveness that came without applause and without forgetting. There was no toast, no announcement, just a long table full of ordinary noise, Daisy's story stretching past the point anyone was still following it, someone's fork against a plate, laughter that this time included everyone. Outside, the last of the daylight caught the new leaves on the oaks along the street, and somewhere down the block a lawnmower ran late into the evening, the small, unremarkable sounds of a city that had gone on, as cities do, entirely indifferent to the quiet reckonings of one family's table. Near the end of the meal, Nolan looked up and found Harper already looking at him, the way she had in the workshop doorway all those months ago. Except there was nothing left unspoken in it now, nothing hidden beneath an envelope or folded inside a silence. Neither of them had wanted to be the first to break. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. This time, nobody had to pretend not to see each other anymore.